Well, thank you all. You see, we got some really high-powered people here today, and I'm also looking at my schedule, and I see that we've skipped a cog in the wheel. So I'm going to keep my remarks very short. You didn't come here to hear me anyway. Just about everything I have to say, I have said over and over again, and you good people have probably read it over and over again because you're on my mailing list. But I do feel an obligation to say something and sort of earn my keep here today. And I just want to touch on a few random thoughts. I had to scrap every note I had last night. I thought, well, what am I going to talk about? And I really didn't know. I was totally at a loss as to what I could say that's really meaningful and something new. And it didn't dawn on me until this morning. And Jim can verify that. We got up before breakfast this morning, and I was working on my computer. And I remembered a line from a piece of prose poetry that you've all heard. It's called Desiderata. Desiderata. And I remember there was a line in there, and so I looked it up. And I thought, like Jim did, that maybe this came from antiquity or some Greek guy back a couple of centuries ago. It turned out no. Actually, that was a myth because one of the churches that used this prose desiderata posted it on one of its archstones or a line or two, and then they put the date of the building of the church. And so everybody, the original founding of the church, not the building, but the founding of the church, which was like 1600 or something. So that got into the myth passages that this poem was written hundreds of years ago. It turns out it was written in 1927 by a guy named 1927 Max Ehrmann. That's right, Max Ehrmann. It's not that important, but the point is that everybody's heard this poem, but there's one line that caught my attention because I was looking around the room last night, and the one thing that struck me as this common thread, this common denominator to all of you folks that I could see is something that's very hard to describe with plain words. I've heard the phrase used, fire in the belly, and that comes pretty close to it. But there's no phrase. You can look in people's eyes. You've seen, we've all stood up here today, and the one thing that's common, is it not, to everybody is that they're clear. There's real clarity as who they are. They're not wandering around wondering, why am I here, Lord? I have something important to do. You bet we have something important to do. And everybody's got it clear. And we're doing it. We're doing what we can. This is a quality that you don't see very often. And we had a whole room full of it, and we still do have a bigger room full of that quality tonight. And so that's what made me think about this poem, Desiderata. And the line, of course, you've already guessed. It's, you are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. And whether you know it or not, no doubt the universe is unfolding exactly as it should. I don't know what that does to you, but it's a great source of consolation to me to know that we don't have to be so smart as to figure out every step we take along the way. If we just open our minds and our hearts and follow that feeling, because that's part of our nature, our instinct, our genetic encoding. We are doing, if you're ever wondering what is it you should be doing, you are doing it because you have no choice. It's programmed into you. And we're part of that universe, and we're unfolding exactly as we should. And that's the quality that I have seen here, and it's very inspiring to me. And with a force like that behind us, we cannot lose. Only a question of how long it's going to take, but we cannot lose. So I just wanted to start with that. That was my philosophical comment for the day. Now we move on to more practical things, and I'll try and keep this short. I have so many things to choose from, but I've got to pick the most important ones. I'd like to go back to Bill Coates' presentation because that's fresh in everybody's mind. And boy, did he have a lot of questions, right? And made people think. Not everybody agreed on the answers because that's natural, especially in a group like this. But I felt the reason there was some question about what the answer is or should be is because words need to be defined. Most words, if you look them up in the dictionary, they got 5 or 6 different meanings. And you take your choice. What did you mean when you used that word? You know? And so we asked the question that Bill was asking, and he said, are we at war? Well, what is war? Is that a physical war or is it spiritual war? What is war? It needs to be defined. And who is the enemy? What does the word enemy really mean? Is that a mortal enemy? Is it just an opponent? Is it somebody we have to destroy or somebody we can ignore? And all of that. And then how do we do things differently? Is a really good question. It's taken a preoccupation of many of us here, especially myself. How do we do this differently? We know it's not working so far. We've got to do something different. And then do you have a strategic plan? Well, strategic, how do we define that word? So, all of these words are deep because depending on how we answer those questions and define those words, that completely contours our answer to the question. And I'd like to just give you the answers that are in my mind as they relate to Freedom Force International, because that's why we're here. The question, are we at war? In my mind, you bet we're at war. This is total war. It's not just a military war. And I say just a military war, because that's not the ultimate war. The ultimate war is psychological, spiritual, it's motivational, it has to do with motive, the greatest tool, the greatest weapon in any war is the mind, even in military war. If you can defeat, as Sun Tzu said, the greatest success or the greatest achievement in warfare is to defeat your enemy without fighting him. You do that psychologically. You convince him that he cannot win. You convince him that he's not appreciated, or you invent the weather and cause storms to fall on him or something like that. But the psychological weapon is certainly, if you don't want to say it's more powerful than the physical weapon, I think you'd have to agree that it's at least as powerful. We're at war. I say it's a psychological war. It's an ideological war, because ideology, what do you believe in? And what is the function of what's our role in society? What's our obligation to each other? How do we get along? Each of us being an individual who has a certain self-interest for themselves and their family and their friends and their community and their nation, and that's a higher priority than somebody else's family and friends and nation. And we've got all these conflicting interests, and the collectivists of the world would like us to believe that because of this part of our human nature, we are intrinsically evil, because that's competition and that's profit motive and all these other things, and it means we're heartless and all those things. But it's part of our nature. And remember, the universe is unfolding exactly as it should. So if it's part of our nature, that's supposed to be that way. That's part of the universe. And it doesn't have to be for evil. In fact, I believe that this feeling of self-preservation and self-improvement and protection of your family and your friends, that is one of the most powerful positive forces that there is in the universe. As long as we have some rules and regulations about what are the limits of this thing, what are the things that we can do to our neighbors, to our friends, at what point, it boils down to this, at what point is it justified for us to use physical force against another person? That is a question that is the most fundamental of all, because depending on the answer to that question, then we can define what is the proper role of the state. If we don't answer the first question first, though, we can never define the proper role of the state, because the state is the legalized expression of physical force. We all agree, meaning we made a law, a majority vote or something. This is what we're going to say. It's okay to use physical force for this. So that's the basic rule of social order that we must really think a lot about if we want to create a world and live in a world where people live together in spite of these competitive instincts, which can be positive because they improve life, really. So how can these people live with these competitive instincts and yet not become destructive and evil and destroy the freedom and the opportunities of other people? So that's the basic question. It's asked in many different ways, nothing new for you folks. But in Freedom Force, we have the answer. That's our answer. And it is that the proper function of the state is to exercise powers that were given to it by the people. That's another fundamental element there. Where does the state, and notice I didn't say government, I'm using the word state deliberately. We don't have time to go into that, but maybe during a Q&A period you may want to ask me about that. But where does the state get its authority to use physical force against anybody? And most people would say, well, it's granted to them. You only have two choices. It either comes from the people or it comes from the conqueror. I mean, it's the leader, the great leader that invaded a country and his armies were superior to the defending armies. And so therefore, now we have a new state, a new set of faces. And those people would claim that, well, we have a right to make these decisions, at what point we can use force, lethal force, because we won. We won the war. And really, that's not a bad basis for it, because all constitutions and all laws are really based on that. We would not have an American Constitution. We would not have a Bill of Rights. We would have nada if our military hadn't been successful in the battlefield. It's as simple as that. If you cannot defend and earn your rights against a force, a physical force that's trying to take it away from you, if you cannot defend yourself, you are a slave to the one that attacks you. And I don't care what's at the national level or in your own home. If somebody breaks into your house and you have no means of defending yourself, you have no rights. Believe me. You may say, wait a minute, you can't do this to me. Look, here's the Constitution. See, it says right here, yeah, I've got the rights. Boom, and then you're through. I have some friends that believe that if they just quote certain passages from the Constitution and say it very sternly, that somehow protects them in the court. It's unconstitutional, Your Honor. Clunk, they're in the cell, you know. So it all comes down to it was Mao Zedong, and he's not my best hero, but the one thing he did say that I have to agree with, you know where I'm going, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Now, this is a harsh fact. I wish it weren't that way. I hate that. But that's the way it is. This is the universe that is unfolding exactly as it should. We must recognize these basic fundamental facts. And so when we came to this point of trying to decide what is this rule that we can all abide by, where we can live in spite of our competitive instinct, we can live together in optimum harmony and produce the greatest benefit, and here it goes, for the greatest number of people. But we don't do it because we're doing it for the greater good of the greater number. We're doing it because it's for the greater good of ourselves. That's why we're doing it. And that just turns out to be the greater good of the greater number. But that was not our goal. So, having said all of that, and this is old pathways for most of you I know, we come to the question of, all right, quit talking about it. What's the formula? What's the rule? How do we measure whether this particular use of lethal force is justified or not? And the question is, where did it come from? And I'm back to that issue again. It comes from the people. And at least most of us would agree that that's the best way to do it. We have to choose. We could say, well, let the state decide. Some people do that. They do believe that. Most people don't. We decided that it has to come from the people. So therefore, the question is, what can an individual do that justifies his or her use of lethal force against another human being? Because if the state gets it from the people have to have it. If the people don't have it, they can't delegate it to the state. It's simple. So we come now to the individual, which is the fundamental unit of individualism. That's why that word is used. And we think about it and think about it and debate it and talk about it, and it comes always to this, that you can use lethal force against another person, and nobody will, well, very few people would ever say that it was unjustified. if it is used in the defense of life, liberty, and property. Nothing more. Nobody would condemn you if you had to defend your life, liberty, and property, even to the extent of using lethal force. Now, some people say, oh, I'd rather die. I'd rather be killed than kill. And they probably really mean it. But I'm not in that category, and I don't think most people are. And so I think we have a chance, if we want to create a broad ideological movement in the world, is to make it very clear in our minds, this is our platform. This is the foundation of everything is built on that, because everything in the world of social order and politics and economics and all of that is ultimately based on this question. How do we solve a problem? Do we do it voluntarily, or do we do it under coercion and under threat of physical force? That's the basic fundamental. And if we recognize and really get it clear in our minds that the only basis for the use of physical force is in the defense, the negative quality of the state, in defense of life, liberty, and property, nothing more. If we really get a hold on that, then we can turn to the state and we say, well, that's all the state can do too, because that's where it gets its power. And all of a sudden, with that vision in our mind, we can look at all of the laws that have been created and many of the constitutions as well, and we see that 99% of it is illogical. It's not based on this principle. And that is, I think, the enemy. The enemy is that ideology that thinks or claims to rationalize that it is okay for a group of people, just by their sheer numbers, because they outnumber another group, in other words, majority rule. We have more numbers than you. It's like meeting on a battlefield, and that used to be done, I am told, in some cases. Armies would meet on the battlefield, and they'd count the horses and count the cannons, and oh, well, you win. You got more than we do. And it saved a lot of bloodshed. And that's the basis of voting, is it not, in a democracy? You count the number of potential guns. And well, you beat me. We don't have to go on the battlefield and slug it out, because look, you got the more numbers, and chances are, if we had to go to the battlefield and kill each other, you would win because you have more soldiers. That's the basic concept, really, behind democracy. Well, if that's not acceptable, if it's not just a question of numbers, if it's a question of defending individuals, even against the majority or against all others, it could be 1,000,000 people to one. The numbers are not important. The rights of that one individual to be defended, his life, liberty, and property. He has a right to defend himself. And it makes no difference whether he's under attack by one person or 1,000,000 people. In some ways, you might say the more opponents he has, the more right he has to defend himself. But under democracy and all this collectivist nonsense, it's just the other way around, that if you can just get the votes, it's winner take all. Well, this is the most fundamental concept, and there's a name for it, and of course I've heard it used here in this room over and over again, which delights me no end. Instead of calling this thing communism or socialism or capitalism or all these other undefinable words, people should be using the right words, and that is collectivism on the one hand, individualism on the other hand. And if you want to, take a little time and analyze the roots of those words and what they mean, it really is the foundational answer to most of the political, social, and economic problems that face the world today. The enemy, I believe, my contribution to this discussion is, the enemy is collectivism. And granted, there are other things. There are spiritual values that get in play here, and they're very important. But even some of the most spiritual people in the world, if they can somehow get twisted in their minds that the ideology of collectivism is a good thing for society, very spiritually minded people can become our enemy. And we see that happening all the time.